Some dogs are called dangerous because they bite, but Ranger was called dangerous because he refused to forget the truth. On a gray morning in Ashford County, when the fog sat low over the pine trees and the air smelled faintly of wet gravel and old leaves, 3 men stood outside the last kennel at the County K-9 retirement shelter and kept their hands away from the gate. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the other dogs had gone quiet, as if the whole place understood that something heavy was about to happen. At the end of the concrete row stood Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a black and silver coat, cream markings along his chest, and amber eyes so sharp they seemed to listen before they looked. A red folder hung from a hook beside his kennel. Across the front, in thick black letters, someone had written, "Dangerous. Do not approach." The veterinarian held that folder close to her coat, her face tight, with the kind of sadness people wear when they have already made a decision they hate. Beside her, the shelter manager kept glancing at the latch, then at the dog, then toward the gravel driveway where an old blue pickup had just stopped. The passenger door opened slowly, and Ethan Caldwell stepped out with one hand on a white cane and the other resting against the truck for balance. He was 41, broad-shouldered, white, with dark brown hair touched by gray at the temples, and a face shaped by weather, discipline, and years of learning not to ask for pity. His eyes, pale and unfocused, did not follow the movement around him, but his head tilted slightly at every sound. The scrape of boots, the nervous breath of a handler, the low rattle of Ranger's chain against the kennel door. Ethan had not come looking for a miracle. His younger sister had driven him there because she believed a retired service dog might help him walk through the world again. But Ethan hated the word help. Help sounded like a soft cage. Help sounded like people lowering their voices when he entered a room. He took one careful step forward, then another, his cane tapping lightly against the concrete. Ranger rose inside the kennel. The handler stiffened. "Mr. Caldwell, stop right there," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Ethan froze, not because he was afraid, but because he heard something in the dog's breathing change. It was not a growl. It was not warning. It was recognition. Ranger moved toward the gate so quickly that the metal frame trembled. One officer reached for the latch cover. The vet whispered, "Don't move," but Ethan only turned his face toward the sound. Standing in the pale fog with his empty eyes and steady hands, then the most dangerous retired police dog in the county did something no one in that shelter had ever seen. Ranger lowered his head, folded his front legs, and lay down flat on the cold concrete. Not in defeat, not in fear, but with the quiet discipline of a soldier recognizing another wounded soldier. For several seconds, no one breathed. Ethan slowly extended his hand through the safe gap near the gate. Ranger did not snap. He did not pull away. He pressed his muzzle gently against Ethan's fingers and held still, as if he had been waiting years for the one man who could not judge him by what he saw. The fog moved between the kennels like a curtain being drawn back, somewhere beyond the shelter fence. A crow called once from the top of a pine. Ethan felt the warmth of the dog's breath against his palm, felt the rough edge of an old scar beneath the fur near Ranger's jaw. And something inside him, something long locked and unspoken, shifted. The shelter manager swallowed hard. "He's never done that before," she said. Ethan did not answer right away. He kept his hand there, listening to the dog breathe, listening to the silence gather around them. At last, he whispered. Maybe nobody ever asked him what he was trying to say. And Ranger, still lying at his feet, gave one soft sound from deep in his chest. Not dangerous, not broken, but almost grateful. Ethan kept his hand near the kennel gate long after everyone expected him to pull it back. The concrete beneath his boots held the morning cold, and somewhere above the shelter roof, water dripped from the edge of a rusted gutter in slow, uneven taps. Ranger's breath warmed his fingers, steady and deep, and Ethan found himself counting it without meaning to. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, like the breathing exercises the doctors had taught him after Kandahar, the ones that were supposed to make the darkness feel less crowded. They had never worked as well as that dog's silence. His sister, Claire, stood a few steps behind him, arms folded tightly across her chest, watching with the fragile hope of someone afraid to believe too soon. She was 36, with chestnut hair tucked under a knit cap and blue eyes that had spent too many years pretending not to be worried. "Ethan," she said softly, "are you all right?" He almost smiled. People asked him that often now. They asked it when he poured coffee without spilling it, when he stepped off a curb, when he sat too quietly at family dinners. "Are you all right?" had become the polite way of asking how much of him was still missing. "I am standing," he said. "That counts." The shelter manager, Malina Porter, it gave a small, nervous laugh that disappeared quickly in the damp air. She was a strong woman in her late 50s, with white skin weathered from years outside, silver hair pinned under a wool cap, and a voice that seemed built for calming frightened animals. But even she sounded unsure when she said, "Ranger has never responded to anyone like this. Not once in 18 months. Ethan turned his face slightly toward her. "What happened to him?" The question changed the air. The handler shifted his weight. The veterinarian looked down at the red folder. Marlene's hand rested on the gate, but she did not open it. "He served with Ashford County for almost 6 years. She said, "Search work, missing persons, evidence detection, disaster response. He was one of the best dogs this county ever had." Ranger's ears twitched at her voice, but his head remained beneath Ethan's hand. Then something went wrong. Ethan said. It was not a question. He knew the shape of stories people did not want to finish. Marlene exhaled through her nose. There was an incident at the old rail station outside town. His final call. After that night, he was labeled unstable, too unpredictable for police work, too risky for adoption. The word unstable landed gently, but Ethan felt the old sting behind it. Different officers had used different words for him after the blast. Disabled, adjusting, medically retired. They were not cruel words. Not exactly, but they all sounded like doors closing from the other side. Ethan drew his hand back slowly. Ranger lifted his head, following the movement as though the air itself had shifted. "I told Claire I did not want a dog," Ethan said. "I still know my way around my own apartment." Claire lowered her eyes, but said nothing. She knew that was only half true. He knew the 23 steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, the 3 boards that creaked near the hallway, the distance from the sink to the stove. He could fold laundry by touch and repair old radios by listening to the tiny scratch of loose wires. But he had stopped walking past the second block alone. He had stopped going to church because the greetings after service felt too careful. He had stopped sitting near windows because sunlight had become something other people described. Back in Portland, his apartment smelled of soda, black coffee, leather, polish. and old cardboard boxes he never unpacked. His medals sat inside a dented tin beneath his bed. His uniform hung in a garment bag at the back of the closet. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because touching it made the past stand too close. On quiet nights, when the refrigerator hummed and traffic whispered far below, Ethan would wake with his hand reaching for a rifle that was not there. In a room that was perfectly safe, under a roof that did not know the sound of war. He is not a guide dog, the handler said, perhaps too quickly. He is retired, police K9. Different training, different temperament. Ethan nodded. I am not a perfect candidate either. The words were dry, almost humorous. But something in them made Marlene's expression soften. Ranger stood then, slow and deliberate. His paws made no restless scraping. He simply rose, stepped close to the gate, and pressed his chest against the metal as if the barrier had become an insult. Ethan heard the chain shift, heard the faint leather creak of the dog's old collar. I heard one low breath that seemed to ask for patience. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan thought of the last thing he had seen before the world went white, years ago. Not fire, not fear, but the pale morning sky over a road outside Kandahar, wide and quiet, innocent as a sheet of paper. After that, everything had become sound, touch, memory, and guessing. He had spent years believing blindness was the end of certainty. But standing there in the shelter fog, with the county's most feared dog waiting inches away, Ethan wondered whether sight had fooled people more often than darkness ever had. Open it, he said. The handler immediately objected. But Marlene raised one hand. The shelter went still again. The latch lifted with a small metallic click that traveled through the morning like a match being struck. Ranger did not rush out. He waited until Ethan stepped back, then walked through the gate with the careful discipline of an old officer crossing a church aisle. He circled Ethan once, nose working softly along his coat, his boots, the old canvas bag against his hip. Then Ranger stopped at Ethan's left side, exactly where a working dog would stand, and leaned his shoulder against the veteran's leg. Ethan's cane trembled once in his hand. Claire covered her mouth. Marlene whispered, "Well, I will be." Ethan lowered his fingers to the dog's head, feeling the dense fur, the scar near the jaw, the living warmth of a creature everyone had already judged. "All right," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the fog. 7 days. We try 7 days. Ranger looked toward the distant road beyond the shelter fence, ears rising towards something no one else heard, and gave 3 quiet barks into the gray morning. By noon, the fog had thinned into a pale veil over Ashford County, and Ethan rode home in the passenger seat of Claire's pickup with Ranger lying across the back seat as if he had always belonged there. The dog made no restless sounds, no anxious pacing, no sharp breaths against the glass. He simply watched the passing road with amber eyes, ears lifting whenever the tires crossed. A bridge seam or loose gravel crackled beneath the truck. Ethan sat with one hand resting on his white cane and the other on the canvas bag at his feet, listening to the shape of the world moving around him. The shelter had faded behind them, but the 3 quiet barks Ranger had given before they left still lingered in his mind. They had not sounded like fear. They had sounded like a warning sent ahead of time. Claire tried to fill the silence with ordinary things, because ordinary things were easier than hope. She talked about the weather, about the price of heating oil, about a diner on Route 9 that still made blueberry pancakes the size of dinner plates. Ethan answered when he needed to. but most of him was listening to Ranger. Every few miles, the dog's breathing changed slightly, deepening when they passed pine woods, sharpening near intersections, softening again as the road curved toward Portland. It amazed Ethan how much a creature could say without words. His apartment stood on the second floor of an old brick building above a closed tailor shop, 12 miles from the shelter, and 2 blocks from a church whose bells rang 6 minutes slow. The stairwell smelled of dust, lemon cleaner, and radiator heat. Ranger climbed beside him without pulling, pausing at each landing as if counting steps with him. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. People often rushed to help him without asking, grabbing his elbow, steering him as if blindness had made him a package to be delivered. Ranger did not do that. The dog waited, matched his pace, and leaned close only when the floorboard changed beneath Ethan's boot. Inside, the apartment was small but orderly. A narrow kitchen, a worn brown couch, a workbench near the window where Ethan repaired old radios, cassette players, field watches, and anything else that still believed it had one more song left inside. The place carried the scent of coffee grounds, solar, warm dust, leather, and the faint cedar blocks Claire had put in his closet, even though he told her not to fuss. Ranger entered slowly, not timidly, but with professional care. His nails clicked once across the hardwood, then stopped. He sniffed the doorway, the baseboard, the couch, to the table leg, the workbench, and then the old green duffel bag tucked beneath the window. Ethan heard the change at once. The dog's breath caught. A low sound gathered in his chest. Not anger, not threat, but recognition so deep it made the room feel colder. Claire set down the adoption papers on the kitchen counter. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan turned his head. "Where is he?" Ranger moved to the duffel bag and stood over it, nose pressed to the canvas. The bag had not been opened in months. Ethan knew what was inside without touching it. A folded uniform shirt, a cracked compass, a small stack of letters tied with paracord, and beneath them, wrapped in a wool sock, the old army watch that had belonged to Sergeant Luke Mercer. Luke had been more than a friend in the strange brotherhood of war. He had been the voice that kept Ethan laughing when the nights stretched too long and the road ahead felt made of dust and doubt. After Ethan came home blind, Luke had written twice from Maine, saying he had taken a quiet security job in Ashford County and wanted to visit soon. Then the letters stopped. People said Luke had moved on, disappeared into one of those private storms veterans sometimes chose not to explain. Ethan had never believed it. But grief without evidence becomes a room with no door. Ranger poured the duffel once, careful but firm. Ethan knelt beside him and ran his fingers along the zipper. The metal tab was cold. When he opened the bag, the smell of old canvas and folded years rose into the apartment. Ranger lowered his head until his nose touched the wrapped watch. Then, with a sound so soft, Claire barely heard it, the dog whimpered. Ethan unwrapped the watch and held it in his palm. It had stopped at 3:17. It had been stopped for years. Ranger stared at it, body still, ears forward, as if listening to a voice trapped beneath the cracked glass. Ethan felt the tiny weight of the watch, the worn strap, the dent near the crown, and something passed through him that was not memory exactly, but the sudden sense of a hand reaching from far away. "You knew Luke," he whispered. Ranger answered with 3 quiet barks, each one measured, Each one aimed not at Ethan, not at Claire, but toward the window facing the old road north. The room remained still after Ranger's 3 barks. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt aimed. Ethan sat on the floor with Luke Mercer's watch in his palm, the stopped hands resting forever at 3:17, while Ranger stood facing the window as if the old road north had called his name from miles away. Claire did not speak at first. She knew the look on her brother's face. Even without his eyes finding hers, it was the look he wore when some locked part of him had opened. Not enough to heal, but enough to hurt cleanly. Outside, afternoon traffic moved along the wet street below, tires whispering over pavement. A horn calling once in the distance. The church bell sounding its slow and imperfect hour. Ranger ignored all of it. His ears remained fixed toward the north, toward Ashford County, toward whatever memory had followed him home. Ethan closed his fingers around the watch. "Claire," he said quietly. "Do you remember Luke?" She drew in a small breath. "Of course I do. He said he was working security near Ashford before he disappeared. You told me that." Ranger was there. The words settled between them like dust in sunlight. Claire moved closer, careful not to step between Ethan and the dog. "You do not know that for sure." Ethan almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, I do not know much for sure anymore." He lifted the watch slightly. "But that dog knew this before I said Luke's name. He knew the smell, the object, maybe even the time." Ranger turned then, padded back across the hardwood, and touched his nose to the watch with such care that Claire's expression softened despite herself. Ethan felt the small movement against his hand and remembered Luke's voice, bright and rough around the edges, telling him once that dogs did not lie because they had no use for pride. By evening, rain began to fall over Portland, tapping the window glass in soft, uneven lines. Claire made coffee, though Ethan only held the mug for warmth. Ranger lay beside the green duffel bag, chin on his paws, watching the watch as if guarding a flame no one else could see. Every so often, he lifted his head and listened toward the window. At 3:17 in the morning, Ethan woke before the dog moved. He did not know why. The apartment was dark, though darkness meant little to him now. The radiator hissed. Rainwater dripped from a gutter outside. Somewhere, a truck passed through a puddle with a long sigh of tires. Then Ranger stood. No bark, no growl, just the soft shift of 70 pounds rising with purpose. Ethan reached toward the nightstand, fingers closing around his cane. "Ranger." The dog came to his side and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's knee. Not pulling, not demanding, asking. Ethan sat very still. In the old days, before the blast, he had trusted maps, orders, sunlight, faces. Afterward, he had learned to trust the small truths left behind the angle of a draft under a door, the texture of a curb beneath his cane, the change in a person's breathing when they were about to lie. Now, a retired police dog was standing beside him in the dark, asking him to follow a memory. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and worry. "Ethan, what is wrong? I need a ride to Ashford." Pause. Now the watch stopped at 3:17. Ranger woke at 3:17. Luke vanished near Ashford. I am done pretending those are separate things. By 4 o'clock, Claire's pickup was cutting north through rain and empty highway, headlights spreading white across the blacktop. Ethan sat in the front seat with the watch in his coat pocket and Ranger upright behind him, nose angled toward the road ahead. The farther they drove, the more focused the dog became. He did not sleep. He barely blinked. When they passed the county sign, Ranger gave one low breath, and Ethan felt it through the back of the seat, like a message arriving through wood and steel. Ashford County at dawn smelled of wet pine, diesel, cold stone, and old secrets. Claire stopped at a diner near the courthouse. A square white building with a faded blue awning and a bell above the door that jingled tiredly when they entered. The air inside carried bacon grease, burnt coffee, maple syrup, and the hush that falls when strangers arrive too early. Ethan heard conversations thin out around them. A spoon stopped against a mug. A newspaper folded halfway and did not finish. Ranger stood at Ethan's left side, calm but alert. At the counter, an older man cleared his throat. That dog should not be in here. Ethan turned his face toward the voice. Do you know him? No one answered. Then from a booth near the back, a gravelly voice said, Everybody in this town knows Ranger. Most just know the wrong story. The man who spoke was Harold Whitaker, a retired Ashford deputy with white hair, tired shoulders, and eyes the pale green of winter glass. His hands rested around a coffee cup he had not touched. When Ethan said Luke Mercer's name, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Harold looked at Ranger, then at the cane in Ethan's hand, then at the old army watch Ethan placed on the table. For a long moment, only the rain against the windows spoke. Finally, Harold whispered, I wondered when that dog would bring somebody back. Harold Whitaker did not touch the watch at first. He only looked at it, the way a man looks at a door he once promised himself never to open again. The diner around them stayed unnaturally quiet, though the griddle kept hissing behind the counter and rain kept threading down the front windows in silver lines. Ethan could feel every person listening. He could feel it in the way spoons no longer clicked against mugs, in the way chairs stopped creaking, in the way even Claire's breathing had grown careful beside him. Ranger stood between Ethan's chair and Harold's booth, his body still, his ears forward, his amber eyes fixed on the old deputy with a patience that felt almost human. Harold finally reached out and turned the watch over with 2 fingers. Luke wore this overseas, he asked, before he gave it to me. Ethan said. He said it ran 5 minutes, slow but never quit. Harold's mouth tightened. Sounds like him. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You knew him. I knew of him first. Then I knew enough to wish I had helped him sooner. The words carried no drama. Only weight. Harold slid the watch back across the table as if returning something sacred. Luke came to Ashford after he left the service. Quiet fellow. Fixed fences. Worked nights watching county storage buildings. Helped at the veterans' office when they were short on hands. Folks liked him because he listened more than he talked. Ethan's fingers closed around the watch. Then why did everybody stop saying his name? A long silence followed. Outside, a passing truck sent a hush of water against the curb. Ranger lowered his head and released one soft breath. Harold looked toward the window. Not because there was anything to see there, but because some truths were easier to face sideways. Back then, Ashford had a fund for injured veterans and retired officers. Donations, grants, memorial money, community drives. It was supposed to pay for ramps, heat bills, medical rides, service animals. Things people needed but were too proud to ask for. Claire's voice was low. Supposed to Harold nodded once. Luke thought money was disappearing. Not all at once. Just enough that nobody wanted to notice. A repair invoice that cost too much. A check made out twice. A storage lease no one could explain. He started asking questions. Ethan heard the old deputy's thumb brush the rim of his coffee cup again and again. A nervous rhythm. A guilty one. And Ranger Ethan asked. Harold's voice softened. Ranger was assigned to a canine handler named Paul Danner. Danner was respected. Too respected. Maybe the kind of man people trusted because the uniform fit him well. Ranger's ears twitched at the name. A low rumble rose in his chest, then faded when Ethan touched his shoulder. Harold noticed, so did everyone else in the diner, that last night. Harold continued. There was a call about a break-in at the old Ashford rail station. Place had been closed for years, but the county still used one building for overflow storage, paper records, old evidence boxes, donated equipment. Luke was there. Danner was there. Ranger was there. Ethan's hand tightened over the watch until the metal pressed into his palm. Harold lowered his voice. The report said Ranger lost control, said he disrupted the scene, turned on his handler, and caused enough confusion that important materials went missing. After that, Luke disappeared from town. Danner retired early. Ranger was sent away before anyone could ask why the best dog in the county suddenly became the problem. The bell above the diner door gave a faint tremble, though no one had entered. Ethan heard Claire shift closer. You did not believe the report, she said. Harold gave a tired laugh with no joy in it. Belief is easy when it costs nothing. Back then, I had a pension coming, a wife in treatment, and a town that did not like trouble. I told myself I needed proof. Ethan turned his face toward him, and now Harold looked at Ranger. Now the proof has 4 legs and has been trying to talk for years. Ranger stepped away from the booth then. Sudden, but controlled, his nails clicked across the diner floor as he moved toward a wall covered in old photographs, parade days, Little League teams, fire department breakfasts, county fairs, officers in dress uniforms standing beside polished patrol cars. He stopped beneath one frame and sat. Ethan heard the room shift as people turned. Claire walked over first. Her voice trembled when she spoke. Ethan, there is a photograph of Ranger here, younger, with an officer and another man standing near the edge. Harold stood slowly. Describe him. Claire swallowed. Dark hair, army jacket. He is holding a paper cup. He looks like he did not want to be in the picture. Ethan knew before she said the name. Some part of him had known, since the first touch of Ranger's muzzle at the shelter gate. Claire whispered, "It is Luke." Ranger lifted one paw and placed it gently against the wall beneath the photograph. Then looked back at Ethan, not asking for praise, not asking for comfort, asking to be followed. Harold reached for his coat with hands that had begun to shake. The rail station is 6 miles from here, he said. If Ranger is ready to go back, then maybe it is time the rest of us were brave enough to go with him. The road to the old Ashford rail station ran 6 miles north of town, past shuttered feed stores, wet hayfields, and long rows of pine trees that leaned toward the pavement as if listening to the tires. Claire drove slowly because the rain had turned the shoulder soft, and because no one in the truck seemed ready to arrive too quickly. Harold sat in the back seat beside Ranger, his coat damp at the collar, his hands resting on his knees like a man riding toward a confession. Ethan sat up front with Luke Mercer's watch in his palm, the stopped hands pressed against his skin through the cracked glass. And every mile seemed to make the metal colder. No one spoke for the first few minutes. There was only the steady sweep of the windshield wipers, the low hum of the heater. and Ranger's controlled breathing behind him. Then Harold said, "Luke asked me once if a town could lie so long it started believing itself." Ethan turned his face slightly toward the back seat. "What did you tell him?" "I told him, towns are made of people, and people can get used to almost anything if it keeps their lives quiet." The words settled heavily in the truck. Claire tightened both hands on the wheel. "That sounds less like wisdom and more like an excuse." Harold did not defend himself. It was outside. The road narrowed, and the sound beneath the tires changed from smooth pavement to cracked county asphalt, then to gravel. Ethan felt the shift through the floorboards. Ranger lifted his head before the truck slowed, his ears rising, his body suddenly alert. The smell came through the vents a moment later. Wet iron, soaked timber, creosote, and the mineral breath of old railroad stone. The station had been closed for nearly 20 years, Harold said, though the county still owned the land. Once, it had been the heart of Ashford, where soldiers came home, farmers shipped apples, children pressed pennies on the rails, and widows waited beneath the platform lamps, with gloved hands folded around hope. Now the tracks were dull and broken in places, half swallowed by weeds and rainwater. Claire parked near a chain-link fence with a faded sign that warned visitors to stay out. The gate hung slightly open. Wind moved through it with a thin metallic whine. Ranger was already standing before Harold opened the door. He stepped down into the mud and froze. Nose lifted, eyes fixed beyond the fence. Ethan unfolded his cane and listened. The place had a voice. Rain ticking on tin roofing, water dripping from a broken gutter, loose boards creaking somewhere ahead, the distant tremble of traffic from a highway half a mile away. Beneath all of it, something softer, the quiet of a building that had kept too much for too long. Ranger gave one short bark and moved forward. Ethan followed with his cane in his right hand and his left hand resting lightly on Ranger's harness. Not gripping, not steering, just staying connected. Claire walked close on his other side, while Harold unlocked the old service door with a county key he claimed he had forgotten to return years ago. The door opened with a tired groan. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with dust, rain, and aged paper. Ethan could feel the size of the room by the way sound traveled. His cane tapped wood, then concrete, then a strip of metal that rang faintly under the rubber tip. Ranger moved slowly at first, searching the floor in widening circles. Harold switched on a flashlight, though for Ethan, the light meant only the soft click of the button and Claire's breath catching at what it revealed. "There are still file cabinets in here," she whispered. "Boxes, too. A lot of them." Harold's voice was low. "County overflow. Nobody wanted to sort what was easier to forget." Ranger stopped near the far wall. His breathing sharpened. He scratched once at the floor, then stepped back and barked 3 times. Ethan knelt carefully, setting his cane beside him. His fingers found damp wood, then a seam too straight to be natural. "There is a panel here," he said. Harold came closer, knees popping as he crouched. Together, he and Claire lifted the loose boards. Underneath was not a hole, but a narrow metal compartment set into the floor, its edges sealed with old black tape. Ethan ran his fingers along the surface until he found shallow scratches in the metal. Letters, not deep, but deliberate. Claire leaned close. "It says E.C. Ethan's throat tightened. "His initials." Ranger lowered himself beside the compartment and placed his chin near Ethan's knee. Harold opened his pocket knife and carefully worked the tape free. No one hurried. The rain beat softly above them, patient as prayer. When the lid finally lifted, the smell of cold metal and dry paper rose into the room. Inside lay a small cassette recorder, a folded map of Ashford County, 3 envelopes wrapped in plastic, and a police badge dulled by time. Ethan reached in last, guided by Claire's quiet description, and touched the recorder with trembling fingers. On its side, someone had placed a strip of tape with raised letters cut from a label maker. Claire read them aloud, her voice breaking around the words. For Ethan, trust Ranger. The old station seemed to exhale. Harold took off his hat. Claire covered her mouth. Ethan sat back on his heels, unable to see the box, unable to see the faces around him, but feeling the shape of the moment as clearly as if dawn had entered the room. Ranger pressed his shoulder against him, warm and steady. For years, the world had called the dog dangerous and the missing man gone. But under the floor of a forgotten rail station, in a place where Ashford had hidden its shame beneath dust and rainwater, the truth had waited with Ethan's name on it. Ethan did not press play right away. His thumb rested on the edge of the cassette recorder while rain moved across the old station roof in 1,000 soft taps, each one landing like a question. The little machine felt heavier than it should have, as if all those years under the floor had filled it with more than tape and dust. Claire knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, while Harold stood a few feet away with the old police badge in his open palm. Ranger remained close to Ethan's left side, his body still but alert, his eyes fixed on the service door they had entered through. We should take this to the state police, Claire whispered. Harold nodded, but his voice was rough when he answered, We will, but Luke left it for him. Ethan swallowed. The station smelled of wet pine, cold iron, old paper, and something else beneath it all. Something like time sealed too tightly. He found the play button by touch, for 1 breath, 2 breaths. He hesitated. Then he pressed it. The recorder clicked. He said, and released a voice Ethan had not heard in years. Ethan, if this ever reaches you, I am sorry. Claire made a small sound beside him, but Ethan could not move. Luke Mercer's voice came through thin and uneven, worn by distance, but still unmistakably Luke, still carrying that calm warmth he used to bring into impossible rooms. I do not have much time to explain. The Veterans Fund is being drained through false repairs, storage contracts, and transportation invoices. I copied what I could. Names, dates, accounts. Enough for someone honest to follow. I tried to report it quietly. But quiet is how men like this survive. Harold lowered himself into an old wooden chair, as if his legs had forgotten their duty. The recorder hissed again. Ranger knows the storage room. He found the box before anyone else did. Trust him. If they call him unstable, they are lying. That dog has more honor than half the people wearing badges in this town. Ranger gave one soft whine, so low it seemed to rise from the floorboards. Ethan reached down and touched his head. The tape continued. I hid a duplicate map in the 3rd envelope. The first 2 are copies of records. The badge belongs to the officer who helped me start this and got scared before the end. Do not hate him for fear. Fear makes cowards out of decent men. But sometimes, shame brings them home. Harold covered his eyes with one hand. No one accused him. No one needed to. The truth had a way of naming people without raising its voice. Ethan listened until the tape clicked off. The silence afterward was deeper than before. Not empty, but changed. Claire opened the envelopes with careful hands and described each item for Ethan. Printed ledgers, county payment records, photographs of storage units, handwritten notes, and a map marked with 3 red circles. One circle was the rail station. The second was the county veterans office. The third sat farther north, near an abandoned maintenance shed by the river. At the mention of the shed, Ranger stood. His nails clicked once on the concrete. 3 quiet barks followed. Measured and certain, Harold looked toward the map. That shed was leased through the county for years. He said nobody used it after the flood. At least, that is what I was told. Ethan placed the recorder back in the box. Then we go there. Claire turned toward him quickly. Ethan, we have enough to call this in. We will, he said, calm but firm. But Luke said to trust Ranger, and Ranger is not finished. The maintenance shed stood 2 miles beyond the station. Down a narrow service road, lined with birch trees and rain-dark grass, Claire drove, while Harold made calls to 2 state investigators he still trusted, leaving messages that sounded careful but urgent. Ethan sat in the truck with Ranger's head resting near his shoulder from the back seat. The dog's breath was warm against his ear. Once, as the truck passed over a small wooden bridge, Ranger stiffened, then relaxed, as if counting landmarks remembered by scent rather than sight. The shed appeared at the edge of the river, just as the rain softened into mist. Claire described it in a hushed voice. Grey boards, 1 small window, a saching roof, weeds as high as the bumper. The river behind it moved slow and brown, swollen from the rain, whispering against stone. Ranger stepped out first and did not wait for command. He moved to the door, sniffed the frame, then pawed gently at the lower hinge. Harold found the lock rusted but loose. Inside, the air was stale and cool. Ethan heard Claire pull in a breath. There are boxes, she said. A lot of them. Harold switched on his flashlight. Medical equipment, old wheelchairs, space heaters, winter coats, boxes of service dog harnesses. His voice broke on the last words. These were not treasures in the way people imagined treasure. No gold, no yavels, no miracle shining under glass. But to Ethan, standing in the dark and listening to Claire read labels meant for veterans who had waited for help that never came, it felt like finding a room full of stolen prayers. Ranger walked to the back corner and sat beside a sealed plastic container. On top was a weathered envelope with Ethan's name written in Luke's hand. Claire opened it slowly. Inside was one final note. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. Brother, I could not save the whole thing alone. Maybe that was never the plan. Maybe the plan was that one day, the man who lost his sight would help everyone else finally see. Ethan bowed his head, and Ranger leaned against him, steady as grace. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, but Ashford County still seemed to be holding its breath. State investigators arrived at the rivershed first, in 2 dark sedans, their tires whispering over the wet gravel, their coats smelling of rain and cold air. When they stepped inside, no one raised their voice. No one needed to. The boxes spoke quietly enough on their own. Claire guided Ethan's hand from label to label so he could feel the raised tape, the cracked plastic corners, the folded fabric of winter coats that had never warmed the shoulders they were meant for. Harold stood near the doorway with his hat in both hands. Older than he had looked that morning, as if truth had taken years from him and given them back all at once. Ranger sat beside Ethan, calm and watchful, his amber eyes following every movement, not with suspicion, but with the weary patience of a witness who had waited a long time to be understood. One investigator played Luke's recording again at the station house 2 hours later. With the door closed and the old blinds drawn against the grey light, Ethan listened without moving. The tape hissed. Luke's voice filled the room. And every name, every date, every careful detail landed like a bell struck underwater. Claire sat close enough that her sleeve brushed Ethan's arm. Harold answered every question they asked him. When his own fear became part of the story, he did not hide from it. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, his voice rough but steady. "That is mine to carry." By evening, word had spread through Ashford in the strange way small towns carry news. Not loudly at first, but through diner doors, church basements, gas station counters, and kitchen phones held close to the ear. People came to the courthouse steps before anyone invited them. Some came because they had donated to the Veterans Fund years ago. Some came because they had once needed help and never received it. Some came because they remembered Luke Mercer paying for coffee with quarters and smiling like a man who knew more sorrow than he would ever admit. And some came because they wanted to see the dog they had feared for 18 months. Ranger stood at Ethan's side beneath the courthouse awning while mist lifted from the street and gathered around the streetlights. The red folder from the shelter was there too, carried by Marlene Porter herself. Its warning label softened at the corners from years of handling. She held it against her chest until one of the investigators read a preliminary statement, clearing Ranger's record, pending formal review. The words were careful, official, and dry, but their meaning moved through the crowd like warmth returning to a cold room. Ranger had not been unstable. Ranger had not been the shame of the county. Ranger had tried to protect evidence. And when no one listened, he had remembered. Then a gray-haired man stepped from the back of the crowd. Ethan recognized his voice before anyone said his name. Paul Denner. The former handler sounded smaller than the story had made him. He did not come close. Ranger's body tightened once, then settled when Ethan rested a hand on his head. Dana spoke to the investigators, not to the crowd, and admitted enough for silence to fall hard across the courthouse steps. He had not started the theft, he said. He had looked away, then helped hide what he should have exposed. Luke had found the records. Ranger had found the box. That night at the rail station, the dog had not turned against duty. He had chosen it. No one cheered. Truth, when it finally arrives, does not always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like a town realizing how long it has been standing in the dark. Ethan listened to the wind move between the people, carrying the smell of wet wool, coffee, pine, and old stone. He heard someone crying softly near the courthouse wall. He heard Harold whisper, an apology that was not meant for anyone living. Then Ranger stepped forward. The crowd shifted nervously, but Ethan did not call him back. The dog walked to the evidence table beneath the awning, lowered his head, and took Luke's dulled police badge gently in his mouth. He carried it not to the investigators, not to Dana, not to Harold, but back to Ethan. Then he placed it at the blind veteran's feet and gave 3 quiet barks. The sound rang across the courthouse square, clear and steady, the same signal that had opened every locked door in the story. Ethan knelt, and found the badge with trembling fingers. Code Mittel, Vorn Etges, a life interrupted, a promise kept. Around him, the town remained silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer fear. It was recognition. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Ethan. And for the first time since the morning they met, no one stepped away from the dog. The formal report took weeks. But the truth had already done its quiet work. By the time the first maple leaves turned gold along the courthouse square, Ashford County moved differently after that evening. People still bought coffee at the same diner, still waved from pickup trucks, still complained about rain and road work and heating bills. But something beneath the town had shifted. The Veterans Fund was restored under new oversight, and the forgotten supplies from the river shed finally found their way to the people whose names had waited too long on old lists. A ramp was built for a retired Marine on Willow Street. A furnace was replaced for a widow outside town. Service dog applications that had sat untouched in filing cabinets were opened again. Onabiwan, like windows in a house that had been closed for years, Luke Mercer's name was placed on a bronze plaque inside the courthouse. Not in grand language, but in honest words. He kept faith when silence was easier. Harold Whitaker came to the ceremony wearing his old dress jacket, his hands shaking as he read a public apology that did not try to polish shame into courage. Ethan stood beside him with Ranger at his left side and Claire just behind them, one hand resting lightly between her brother's shoulders. Ethan could not see the plaque, but Claire described it to him afterward, tracing the letters with his fingers until Luke's name became more than memory. Ranger sat through the whole ceremony without moving, except once, when the courthouse bell rang and his ears lifted toward the sound as if answering an old friend. Marlene Porter brought the red folder from the shelter too. In front of the small crowd, she removed the warning page, folded it carefully, and replaced it with a new one that read, Retired K9, cleared for adoption. Exceptional loyalty. Ethan asked if he could keep the old page. No one understood why until he framed it months later and hung it by the door of a small white house near the edge of town, beneath a sign that read, Mercer House. It became a place for dogs no one trusted and veterans who hated needing help. There were no speeches there, no bright promises, no pity disguised as kindness, just coffee in the kitchen, worn chairs on the porch, leashes by the door, and patient animals who understood that healing rarely came when called. Ethan did not become less blind. The world did not hand him back colors, clouds, or faces. But he learned the shape of trust again. He learned the rhythm of Ranger's paws on hardwood, the gentle pressure of the dog's shoulder before a curb, the soft exhale that meant safe, the 3 quiet barks that meant pay attention. Sometimes, near dusk, they walked the old road to the rail station together. The track still slept beneath grass and rust, and the wind still moved through the broken platform with a voice like distant prayer. Ethan would stand there with one hand on Ranger's head and Luke's watch in his pocket. I still stopped at 3:17. No longer a wound, but a witness. And when people asked him if Ranger had saved his life, Ethan always smiled in that small, weathered way of his and said the dog had done something greater. He had helped a blind man see who had never truly been lost, who had only been waiting in the dark for someone loyal enough to lead him home.